Just means more editing for me, I guess, because now I have to edit every episode. Hey there, bibliophiles. Welcome to another episode of From the Archives, a book review podcast where I talk about a book from my library and whether you should or shouldn't read it. I'm Eric, a professor of anthropology at Cuyahoga Community College, and welcome to my library. The books in my library are sometimes old, sometimes rare, sometimes normal, but always interesting. Every episode, I ask myself the following questions. Who wrote it? What's it about? What are other people saying about it, or its, or them, if we review multiple books, that is. Should you read it, and whether I should can it or keep it, chuck it or cherish it, reread or recycle, shelve it or shove it, jettison or set it in. And that one comes from our Jet Set episode. I can't remember exactly which episode number that is, but the episode on Jet Set is where we got jettison. With all that being said, let's pull a book from the shelf. So this week we are talking about Community Civics and Rural Life by Arthur Dunn, published 1920, and it's about 500 pages long. Really, I should probably back up, and before we jump into this week's book, I have a few announcements and updates. So for those of you who are watching this on the YouTube channel, it's obviously being pre-recorded. I think moving forward, the big news is that these are going to be pre-recorded videos, just because I took a look at my summer schedule and, it's not getting any less busy with field work and with summer school that I'm teaching. So I just think it's going to be easiest on myself to modify the streaming to basically, it's just going to be pre-recorded. I'll still upload videos to the Anthropology Archives YouTube channel. That way, those of you who want to actually see what the book looks like, see what my home library looks like, you'll have that option as well. You can also see how things change for me. Like, for example, I got myself a COVID cut. I did the same thing back in October. Basically, I shaved my head. Didn't go as extreme this time. I went with, I think, no clippers at all. Like, no modifier on the clippers. I just went straight buzz all the way down to, like, the scalp back in October. And I think I did, like, 1 or 1.5 this time. So not as extreme. But still, nonetheless, the COVID cut is what I went with this time. Other news and updates. This one is the big one that I wanted to mention. Normally, when I do episodes, at least the traditional format so far, I've gotten into a rhythm. We're almost at 20 episodes here, so I've started to get a rhythm for podcasting. At least I like to think I have. The new update is that I have a new bookshelf. So behind me, for those of you who are watching on the YouTube channel, you can see I've got a new bookshelf. Got these from Menards, which is basically like a Home Depot, but for Ohioans, like Northeast Ohioans, I think. I don't know how far out Menards goes. I think it's just a thing that's in, northern Ohio. I don't know. I could be wrong. But I've got a new bookshelf here. Actually, 2 new bookshelves. And interestingly, we did the math wrong when we got our new bookshelves, and we have some books that will not fit on the bookshelves anymore. So we're having to push forward the timetable on episodes that I was going to be doing. So the next few episodes, just because of getting the new bookshelves and changing how things are arranged on our bookshelves. I really like these new bookshelves. The fun thing is they're I think the model is like light oak or something like that, or is what they called it on Menards. It has these little cubbies for your indexing of things. So like if you want to have categories for books, which I definitely do, you can actually put that on this bookshelf. So I'm really excited about that. The new bookshelf is finally here. So that's the exciting news and updates. COVID cut, new bookshelf, new podcast recording schedule. Hopefully that alleviates some of the pressure on me to try and record these live on Thursdays, but it still means the videos will be available. We're still working on the bike fundraiser through Stewards of Historical Preservation. I still have to get the routes planned out. We're still kind of discussing what the routes are going to look like. Those are probably going to be about 13 to 15 miles. along the towpath trail, the Ohio and Erie towpath from Akron to Cleveland, probably mostly in between Akron and Independence, Ohio. So we're still working out the routes on that, and then once we have those released, I'll share those on the various, I guess you could say socials. I don't really do socials for this podcast. I'm sure it's a detriment for me, but for others, it's probably, a godsend that I don't have a Twitter or a Facebook to broadcast all this stuff on. But I do have a Telegram channel, so follow the Telegram channel if you want updates about things that are going on, or YouTube if you want to see other videos that I'll be uploading, like the do-it-yourself electrical resistivity meter that I'm going to be using in the field this summer, or if you want to see any of the fieldwork updates, I'll be posting those not on a timetable or schedule, but as they happen over the summer, because we've got a couple of field sites that we'll be excavating in Cuyahoga Falls and up in Parma, Ohio. I think it's in Parma, or maybe it's in Middleburg Heights this summer. So keep an eye out for that stuff as well. So those are the big updates for the podcast right now. So from here on out, we're going to be pre-recording a lot of it. That also allows me to have guests on with a little bit more ease. So just know that that's going to be the change to things going forward. Anyway, back to this week's book. Community Civics and Rural Life. So this book is from 1920. To give you a little context about this book, I have a whole bunch of books on my bookshelf that are, you might be able to tell from video if you're watching on the YouTube channel. They look old because they're hardback books and they just have that look of an old book. A lot of them actually I acquired from my great aunt Cressy. So she used to be a school teacher in rural Indiana County, Pennsylvania. It gets real confusing when you tell people your relatives are from Indiana, Pennsylvania. They're like, well, which is it? Is it Indiana or is it Pennsylvania? No. The town of Indiana, Pennsylvania. Interestingly enough, not to go on too much of a tangent here, but Pennsylvania has, I believe, like 35 different state names as town names. Like there's a Wyoming, Pennsylvania. I went into the weeds one time when I was really bored when I was in college, and I ended up looking up like every state in if they had a town in Pennsylvania. I think there's an Idaho, Pennsylvania. There's a California, Pennsylvania for sure, because there's there's an Indiana University of Pennsylvania and there's a California University of Pennsylvania. So if you thought you were confused already, now you're even more confused. There's also Wyoming, Pennsylvania, which is close to, I think, the University of Bloomington, Pennsylvania. I could be wrong on that one. But yeah, there's a lot of states names as towns in Pennsylvania, if you were curious. So anyway, my great aunt Cressy was a school teacher in the early 20th century. Great aunt because it was my grandfather's sister, older sister, and she taught in a one-room schoolhouse back in the early 19-teens and 20s, I think, maybe in the 1930s. And so, when she passed away, she gave all her books to my grandfather, who then gave them all to me via my mom. So we ended up with a lot of books from, an old school teacher in a rural community, which probably explains why it's a community civics book specifically for rural life. And so it's a textbook, and so it doesn't quite read like a textbook you might think of today, or what you're used to. A textbook from 1920 definitely had a different vibe to it. All of the images are actual photos, and they're black and white photos. So for example, they just have pictures in here with small captions. There's not really this idea of like call outs, or how in textbooks they have like sort of a blurb on the side, or they might have a section where they just blow up text, or call outs. I don't know what else to call them, but they're usually paragraphs of text that are separate that go more in depth into a particular topic. That doesn't really happen in these textbooks. It's mostly, I would say, from a graphic design standpoint, it's not very well laid out. But then again, 1920, they're still in the early days of, formatting textbooks, I suppose. And so you have, in some cases here, and I'll probably just keep flipping through to see if I can't find a better example. Yeah, okay, so here's a better example on page 116. So they have, like, on almost every page, there's sort of this bold text that's wrapped around in bold sort of headings, and I guess you could call these like little section headings: the home and community stability. So they kind of call out effects of decline of home ownership. So they kind of call out these different sort of, I guess, topics within each of the chapters. They don't really seem to make sense in my mind. Like, reading through them, they didn't really add much for me, but I could see as an educator, there's sort of like I'm going to use this to refer to specific paragraphs or sections of the textbook. And then they do this really confusing thing in the textbook. I just realized, did I say it was by Arthur Dunn? Yeah, I'm pretty sure I said it was by Arthur William Dunn, 1920. Not that you guys are, clamoring to get these Arthur Dunn books. But that being said, this book is available on the Gutenberg free library. So if you want to check it out for yourself and you don't want to pay for it, because this is, at this point, it's a rare book. It's an old book. I can't imagine you're going to be able to find easily a copy of a 1920 textbook. But you can go to the Gutenberg library, the Gutenberg project, where they digitize all sorts of old archived books and whatnot. So you can actually read along some of this stuff. But what's really confusing is they basically have two different, it's not font. I don't want to say font. It's type sizes. So it might be like 14-point font or 12-point font, and then it's like 10 or 9-point font for activities, which doesn't really make sense in my mind. Or if they're quoting something, they just make the text smaller. And so it's kind of formatted in that sort of typical textbooky way, where at the end of the chapter you have sort of these learning outcomes. No, come on. Of course, I flipped to a page that doesn't have them. Let me flip to one that I actually... Okay, yeah, so here at the end they have like readings. You can sort of see, for those who are watching the YouTube video, at the end, there at the bottom of the page, there's like a section that says readings, recommended further readings, basically. And then there's all these questions that they ask you, and they tell you to write a short response or prompt or something like that. And so from a formatting perspective, it can sort of, you get the hang of it. After about like 60 pages into it, I was pretty caught up to it. And, for 500 pages, it seems like it's a big book, but honestly, every other page has a picture on it. You've got these call-outs, you've got the small text, and I honestly skipped over some of the quotes and whatnot. Like, I don't need to reread the Declaration of Independence like 5 times. They put the Declaration of Independence opening paragraph in here a couple of times, and I'm like, right at the first time, I don't need to read it again. So yeah, from a formatting perspective, I thought it was kind of interesting, to say the least, to see how they formatted this book. Other things that I thought were interesting, obviously we're 101 years into the future from this textbook. So how does this compare to sort of like, is it relevant? So obviously I've talked about who wrote it, Arthur Dunn. Arthur Dunn is the president of the Teachers College of North Dakota, or at least he was in 1920. He's almost 100%. Well, actually, he has to be dead by now. There's no way he's alive. I don't know why I even gave it the shadow of a doubt. Like, Arthur Dunn, he could still be kicking. There's no way, absolutely no way. He probably would have been in his 40s or 50s when this book came out. So mathematically, not possible right now. But president of the Teachers College of North Dakota. For those that don't know, Teachers Colleges, that used to be Teachers College or normal school was the common term. These were like the most ubiquitous of colleges in the United States before World War II. Basically, it's a school that teaches teachers how to teach. And so they didn't really do anything else. They were just there to, you could almost think of them as vocational schools to train teachers. And they were found all over the place. Like even in the town I live in, Wadsworth, we used to have a teacher's college right at the other end of the street that I live on, because, you needed to have a place for teachers to learn. And they would also call these normal schools. I don't remember where they got the term normal from, but if you've ever looked at an old historical atlas and you've seen something that says a normal school on it, then you know that that's where teachers got their degrees to teach in a school. But yeah, comparing this to 2021, honestly, I feel like we may have lost a lot of momentum, because this 1920 book felt very optimistic. It felt very progressive. It was very emphasized. The emphasis was heavily on cooperation and teamwork. So they spend like the first 3 chapters talking about what it means to be on a team, working together. And they give all these examples. And this is also the 1920s, early 1920s, I should say. Obviously, this is 1920, so this is right at the beginning of that decade. This is also when there's this big movement post-World War I for what's known as the Cooperative Movement. So like anthropologists like Marcel Mauss, who wrote the Gift, or the essay on the Gift, which is a very prominent anthropological book. Highly recommend. That one's also for free. You could read online if you just Google essay on the Gift, Marcel Mauss. I think he wrote that in like 1926 or 1925. But he was really pushing for, in France, what's known as the Cooperative Movement. Basically, you have, a business that's shared ownership. It's not like a company that has shareholders. It's cooperatively owned and run. And so it's sort of a different economic model, and it was really pushed in the 1920s. And so that really shines through in this book. So they talk a lot about cooperative granaries. They talk a lot about cooperative farm bureaus and working together. And it's just so interesting reading about this sort of cooperation, this sort of, I guess you could almost say, deification of cooperative movements, of unions, very positive light. Whereas in 2021, if you look at the common public discourse, that sort of doesn't exist. Obviously, post-pandemic, it certainly feels like, at least in the United States, cooperation. You speak in English? Is that an English word? So it just felt like reading this textbook in 2021, and just like, what happened? We used to be bright-eyed and starry. But it also points out that, life ain't so cheery. It's not all, peaches and cream all the time. So I found what was also striking, I guess, about this book was the balanced tone of, we have to work together, which means working with people that have different religious backgrounds, which I was like, whoa, in 1920? What? They're talking about working with people who have different religious backgrounds, working with people who have a common purpose. What's the point of government? I mean, I don't know. It just seems like this book would be banned by Republicans in 2021. The Civics book is promoting communism kind of thing. Or this Civics book makes it sound like America isn't a perfect country. For example, on page 51, I dog eared. I know I'm a bad person. I dog eared a book from 1920. How could I? I'm undog earing it now. Don't worry. I'm smoothing it out. I just dog eared it so that I could come back to it later. Always use a bookmark. I guess, do as I say, not as I do. Use a bookmark when you're using old books. Old books basically being anything older than, I'd say, 25, 30 years old. But here's a quote I wanted to read for you. "We are far from having attained complete democracy. It is a goal toward which men are struggling and have been struggling for centuries, since long before before our Revolutionary War, and in other countries as well as in our own." And then there's another quote in here that I couldn't quite find. I lost it because I read it and then I couldn't find it again. But it's in like the first chapter where they say, some people have said, it's in relation to the Declaration of Independence. The statement that all men are, so this is on page 9, the statement that all men are created equal has troubled many people when they have thought of the obvious inequalities that exist in natural ability and opportunity. But whatever inequalities may exist, people are absolutely equal in their right to satisfy the wants described in this chapter. So it's things like that I felt like were kind of progressive for 1920, that ironically in 2021, those kinds of sentiments might get censored from books, or I don't know. I could be misinterpreting. I haven't had to read a civics book from a high school in a long time. And what I thought was interesting was that this book is like 500 pages, and it's designed for middle or junior high. So it's designed for like 8th graders or 7th graders in an American high school. So basically this at least in 1920, this could be in theory be the highest level that you're going to attend school at. So my great aunt Cressy taught basically 7th and 8th grade back in the day, back in the 1920s. And for a lot of people, at least before the 1930s, I would say, a lot of people, 8th grade was it. Like you'd graduate 8th grade and then you didn't need to keep going on because high school wasn't really necessary if you were working, especially in rural communities where it's like, well, what are you going to do after you finish 8th grade? Well, I'm going to go back to work at the farm. I'm going to go back to work at the family-owned business. So there wasn't really any major benefits to a lot of, especially in rural communities, a lot of people going beyond 8th grade because there wasn't really anything that they needed, college, or not college level, but high school physics for if all you were doing was growing corn kind of thing. So that's a little bit more context as well. So what are other people saying about this book? Funny enough. So we've been through this problem before, especially with Who Pays, which I think was episode 2. which was a insurance policy book from the 1930s. I checked the New York Times. Usually I've tried to use the New York Times Historical Archive to see if people have done a book review. It's a textbook. I mean, you're not going to get a lot of reviews probably for it. I scoured the New York Times archives. I even scoured the Cleveland Plain Dealer, Chronicling America. Didn't find any mention of Arthur Dunn's book. I tried searching Arthur Dunn, tried searching the textbook's title, all that kind of good stuff. No mentions of the book as a review or anything like that on any of these old historical newspapers. But funny enough, I thought, there's no way it's going to have any reviews on anything else. Wrong. So on Amazon, there is exactly one review for this book, because apparently there is a Kindle version of it that you can read for free as well. So if you have a Kindle, you don't want to read it through the Gutenberg library, you can read it on Amazon Kindle as well. So this is from Caitlin from April 16th, 2016. So she gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. And here's what Caitlin has to say. The title is Kindle Edition lacks the photos from the 1920 original, but text appears complete. I have a very tired copy of the 1920 original textbook and came across this free Kindle version. The original textbook is replete with photos offering a glimpse into the past, and it's a shame they aren't in this particular free Kindle version. That said, the few sections of text I compared do match. This book is a unique window into education and views of life and responsibility in the nation at the time. The perspective alone makes this text worthy of perusal. I can't offer any feedback on the print versions being offered. So, yeah, I mean, I haven't read the Kindle version, so I can't comment on Caitlin's review of it. Obviously, I have the original 1920 version. There's obviously nothing on Goodreads about it, and that's because no one's... Actually, I stand corrected. There is one review. It's a 2 out of 5 star by Rachel on January 27th, 2020. So, 100 years later, Rachel didn't have, high marks for it. So, would I recommend you read a textbook about civics and community civics and rural life from 1920? I mean, that's really a call for you. I found it insightful, both because of my personal connection to the person who had to teach this book, because it was my great aunt. But I also found it insightful looking back on 100 years later, how I feel like a lot of the stuff that they were teaching in this civics book is still relevant and critical and integral today. Sure, the cooperative movement has changed, but shoot, let's bring it back. Let's have some cooperative granaries. Let's have some cooperative restaurants. Let's have more partner ownership, new ways of thinking about economic systems, because the current discourse about late stage capitalism, obviously some things aren't working. So I thought the civics book really kind of sparked interest for me. It was easy enough to read, and since it's free both on Amazon Kindle and the Gutenberg library, just check it out. You don't have to read the whole thing. You don't have to read all 500 pages, but take a glimpse through some of it. Certainly some of it is textbooky. Like there's gimmicky stuff on here that does not really enhance, I would say, most people's understanding of things. What is it? Yeah, chapter 3, the need for cooperation, has this sort of early 1920s comic of two cows that are tied together, and how are they going to work together, and it just sort of feels like that sort of propaganda-ish kind of cartoon stuff. So Caitlin's review says you don't get the photos, but the photos are just mostly people like in a farm, like working together, or like there's a photo of some people like in a high school track and field meet, and they're all like standing there like arm in arm. And it's like, I guess you're gaining something out of that, but I think you could do without the pictures, to be honest. There's not really much I got from the pictures other than some fun, silly early 20th century cartoons and artwork, which sometimes is, worthy in its own right. Sort of like when I had the episode on the earliest Americans. Didn't find the book very insightful, but I found the drawings and illustrations very fun and interesting and worthy of saving in their own right. So that's community civics and rural life. If I had to give it a numerical rating, I'd probably give it a solid 2.5. I'm going to keep the book, obviously, because it's my great aunt Cressy's, not going to get rid of it. But since it's, online, freely available, I'd say peruse, as Caitlin recommends, but I wouldn't necessarily say you got to go out and read this book. It's definitely not like some of the other books that I give 5 out of 5s on. So, not much else to say about this book for, very few ratings, very few things to find on it historically. Not much else I can elaborate on. I probably have a few other books similar to this that I might just kind of bundle into one episode. We'll see in the future. Because like I said, I have a bunch of my great aunt Cressy's education books, and then I also have a textbook from 1904, a history textbook that I might use as comparison, like see how things changed, 1904 to say the 1920s, and then obviously fast forward 100 years. I also have a history textbook from like 2008 that I had. I think that was my AP, my AP textbook. I can't remember. But yeah, we'll have to do another episode on old history textbooks and whatnot. So that kind of is a great segue, though, because the next 2 weeks, because of the news I mentioned of the new bookshelves forcing us to sort of downsize some of the books that we have, next week's episode and the week after, I'm going to be reviewing Intro to Archaeology and Intro to Anthropology textbooks. So next week's series of books is going to be Intro to Archaeology textbooks. I have about, oh gosh, I'm looking over the corner here. I have probably about 10 or 12 Intro to Archaeology textbooks. At least 2 of them are duplicates, so it's not really like, oh wow, they're all different. And then I have about the same number of Intro to Anthropology textbooks. Shocker that an anthropology professor would somehow accumulate a bunch of different Intro to Anthropology and Archaeology textbooks. Sometimes they just come to you, right? As a professor, you either get them because other faculty are purging their own bookshelves, or you get them in the mail. Like I've gotten a couple of them just mailed to me out of the blue, like unprompted. Publishers will just send you Intro to Anthropology textbooks in the hopes that, like, hey, read this textbook. Maybe you should use it in your class. And so a bunch of the copies that I have are either instructor editions or promotional copies, that kind of stuff. But basically it's the book. The only difference is that it says, like, on the inside front cover, promotional copy, not for resale. But otherwise it's the same book. So that's going to be next week and the week after. And that'll do it for today's episode. And until next time, never stop reading. From the Archives is produced by Eric Olson, and its theme song is Lukewarm Hazy by Asher Falero.